What's going on, you guys? I am Palukkie, a coach here at the Pokemon Champions League, and today we are doing a draft viability analysis rating for Tapu Bulu. I gotta tell you, Tapu Bulu is probably one of my favorite Tier 1 Pokemon to draft, and the reason for that is because it is so easy to build around. With its ability, its typing, fulfilling a spot in two very, very common cores in Fire, Water, Grass, and Dragon, Fairy, Steel. And absolutely great options. It's a wonderful support mon, but it also hits like a truck and has setup. So very, very good mon. Great first round draft pick, and I would absolutely support you to take it in round 1 in any league that you're in. I will say, if you're new to draft or if you're going into a new season and don't have a plan yet, Bulu is probably the best peace of mind Pokemon because it's going to fit on most teams because it's the bulky grass and bulky fairy type. So we're going to get into a superficial analysis of Bulu right now. And the first thing we're going to talk about is its typing. So a bit of history here, because it bears mentioning. Historically, Fire, Water, Grass cores were the king, right? In all formats, regular, competitive, laddering, and draft. And typically, the way that those cores would run is a very fast offensive fire type that could sweep or set up or do something. A bulky water type, because bulky water types have always done really well. But the problem with that is that water type doesn't protect fire type very well. It doesn't block ground type, and it doesn't block rock type at all. It doesn't resist either. So grass types in that core tended to be forced into very defensive roles, typically blocking physical rock type and physical ground type moves, because before the physical special split, those were all physical moves. So grass types historically have always been built by Game Freak as very physically defensive because that's the best way they work competitively. Not to suggest that Game Freak cares about competitive, but it is sort of a godsend that they've built them that way. With the advent of Gen 6 and the fact that now we have fairy typing, Dragon, Fairy, Steel, I think the consensus would say, has sort of ensconced Fire, Water, Dragon, or Fire, Water, Dragon, Fire, Water, Grass cores as the most common. And in those cores, Fairy does a lot of the same things that Grass does. It switches in on very common threats. It likes to run defensively, though in some cases offensive is good just because of how good Moonblast is. But if you're looking at a physical Fairy type that's not named Mimikyu, I suppose, you're looking at something that at least has a little bit of bulk because it likes to switch in. If you're switching in to a dragon type move and you're afraid of over predicting, you don't want to switch into something or switch in with something that is a frail fairy type. So they're kind of forced into a defensive role. As such, Tapu Bulu does super well in fulfilling both a fire, water, grass core and a fairy, dragon, steel core. It's kind of two birds with one stone situation. It's a bit of a double-edged sword in that you do get a quad weakness by taking both of these types on, but it should be mentioned that Hidden Power Poison is going to be probably one of the least common Hidden Power types in any competitive format. Now in laddering, it's going to be almost you're almost never going to see it. I think the only time you're really going to see HP Poison is on a Keldeo to catch a Bulu switch in. It's for this reason, because it walls it otherwise. In draft format, because you can build based on your opponent's roster, you might see the odd HP Poison, but you're not going to see that coming off of something with Poison Stab, which means you can run Special Defense to account for that. You can run an Assault Vest account for that. And Poison isn't very common coverage anyway, so that is to say you're almost always going to know what's packing Poison-type moves, so that Quad is not nearly as bad as something that's abusable like maybe Gliscor, which is a Quad Ice weakness. So, bit of a double-edged sword, but a bit of a saving grace in that Poison is not going to be super common. And bulky fairies fit most teams. As I mentioned, Fairy, Dragon, Steel cores are the way to go now. Bulky fairies are the way to go, so this is a great Pokemon for that. But it's not passive. It is a bulky fairy, but it is not passive, and that bears mentioning. It's got wonderfully high attack. So if you're running Stall, it's going to give, with the Grassy Surge ability, it sets Grassy Terrain. So if you're running Stall, it's going to give passive recovery to all your mons. If you're running Bulky Offense, it is literally Bulky Offense. If you're running Balance, it's going to be a good defensive switch in on things that you need to chip down. And then if you're running Hyper Offense, it's going to give you Earthquake Protection with Grassy Terrain and that Grassy Surge ability. It's going to give you Earthquake Protection, which is one of the most common coverage moves in the metagame. so you can set up and sweep. So it actually fits a lot of playstyles, which is why at the outset of this video I said if you're new to the format, you can feel safe drafting it round 1 and decide how you're going to play as you go. And because of that grassy surge ability, it's one of the best wingmen out there. Think about teammates like Heatran, who has a quad weakness to ground. Think about Mega Charizard X, who would love to have a possible dragon switch in, plus a possible ground switch in. That is wonderful protection. It works super well to protect a lot of very, very common, fast, heavy hitters in the format. Its stats are wonderful. 70 HP looks a little bit low, but you have to remember that it does have the grassy terrain recovery each turn. So if you think about like when you're doing counts and it says like 2-hit KO after leftovers recovery, slap some leftovers on Bulu and things start becoming 3 or 4-hit KOs. It's insane. Passive recovery is great on this thing. Especially because it has 115 defense and a pretty serviceable 95 special defense. The only unfortunate thing about that is the things that it worries most about outside of Flying Stab is fire and poison, which tend to be run special. In draft format, that's not always the case because physical fire types are actually pretty useful because they can't be burned, they can't be will-o-wisp, but which means it's harder to prepare for them, to tech for them. But still, 95 special defense is super good, and if you have safe switch-ins to fire and poison types, which is not that hard to do, you're fine. And that defense is massive, so it allows you to click Bulk Up, or it allows you to click Swords Dance, and then start getting health back anyway. 130 attack, as I mentioned, is extremely, extremely good. So good, in fact, that if you need to run, like let's say your opponent has Scizor and you want to run HP Fire to lure it, you can run special attack. You could not run much attack investment at all, if any, and still do really well, especially because it gets physical setup like Bulk Up, like Swords Dance. So you've got a lot of nice options to tech there because 85 is decent on special attack, at least enough to chip. And then 75 speed is really, really good. It's not, I mean, it's not a speedy sweeper, obviously, but for the role that Bulu plays, it's really good. Because it doesn't have U-turn, so it's not forced into like a bulky pivot role, though I would argue that having U-turn would make this probably S tier because it's such a good defensive switch-in. But 75 is great. So if you think about the way that speed tiers are usually built, the name of the game is you don't want anything that is 15 apart on your team. So you don't want a mon that is let's say 65, which is a pretty common speed. And then you don't want like 65 and then 80 because those are 15 apart. And the problem is if you have 65 and 80, things can run Modest or Adamant that sit in the right spot because you're not going to catch them if you run Jolly or Timid. So a good way to think about this is Azelf is 115. And if that's the fastest thing on your team, then something like Jolteon or Tapu Koko or I think Crobat, who are 130, can always run Modest because they will guarantee outspeed. So basically anything that's 15 above you can always run Modest or Adamant. So it's important to have very diverse speed tiers and fill those gaps. And 80 is super common. And 100 is super common. And I'd say 60 is pretty common. But 75 is not super common. 65 maybe, because it's 15 below 80. You do see a lot of 60s and 65s. So a good way to think about this is if you have Tapu Bulu, Nidoking, who is 85, only 10 points above you, cannot run Modest. A Modest Nidoking is terrifying. Sheer Force, Life Orb, anything from that thing is going to just destroy. They might be worried about you outspeeding if they run, if you happen to run max speed on some cool set, and they don't run a max speed, so they can't run Modest or Adamant if they go that way against you. So that's really, really useful information. 75 is great for filling speed gaps like that. Moving on to his worthiness overall, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Great defensive fairy type, which is super, super useful in Fairy Dragon Steel Cores for switching into dragons. Also a great grass type, great defensive grass type. Also great for Fire, Water, Grass Cores. Reliable passive recovery for walls, as I mentioned. It fits so many different play styles. It uses several Z crystals successfully. If I had to suggest one, I would say Phytinium Z or Grassium Z. Rockinium Z, if your league drafts Z crystals, is not the best. It's just not the best. It's a great offensive coverage, but not everything gets Stone Edge, so it's kind of hard to play around with. You can run it on this because it does get Stone Edge, but Phytinium Z is used by so many different mons, with Focus Blast and Superpower being great coverage. And Grassium Z just hits so hard on this thing. If you have Grassium Z and you're able to predict your opponent scouting for it, because if they're an opponent worth their salt, they're going to scout for it. If you predict that and you hold it in the back and then use it later, it hits so well. And you don't need leftovers on Bulu because you've got Grassy Terrain recovery, so you can hold a crystal really easily as a defensive mon. All of this makes sense, I hope. It's easy to build around, as I mentioned, because it's a great support mon with blocking Earthquakes and passive recovery. Its speed tier is great for balance, like I mentioned. It's got some really diverse sets like Assault Vest, Swords Dance, Sub-Leech Seed, Choice Band we're going to get into in a moment. The only real downsides that I can detect is no physical Fairy Stab, which is really upsetting, so it doesn't get Play Rough. Getting Play Rough would probably make this S tier because it would hit so hard with Play Rough. But I think that would make it super busted. And then it lacks pivot options. Being such a good defensive pivot, being able to set Grassy Terrain and leave, a lot of times what you find yourself doing is getting in Bulu, taking that end of turn passive recovery and switching out so that later you have it to defensively check something that they're holding in the back. So you're going to be switching it in very often anyway. It would be so useful to this thing to have something like U-turn, but it doesn't get it. So that's a bit of a downside, but it's really only a downside in that it would be a benefit if it got it, but it's not so much a detriment that it doesn't. So let's move on and look at some moves that it gets. Horn Leech is par for the course here. Great for its sustain. It's already got great bulk, so Horn Leech is awesome. And plus with physical setup like Swords Dance and Bulk Up, you're going to be doing a lot of damage. Superpower is great to catch those dark types and to catch those steel types switching in if they don't really understand how Bulu plays. And let's say they switch in Ferrothorn. Like, Superpower is the one thing that you've got to hit a Ferrothorn and blow it away after a Swords Dance. Mega Horn is awesome because bulky grass types, as we'll see in a little bit here, they can sit in front of Bulu. Now, it's not the most accurate move, but it is a really hard-hitting move, and if you have something like Buginium Z, it's going to hit really, really hard. Stone Edge is probably its best coverage, barring Superpower, because it catches flying types that revenge it, and it catches fire types that revenge it, and that's really, really useful, because Bulu hits so hard that they're either going to have to sack something and then bring in something to revenge, do a really fancy double, which is always scary in draft format, especially when players are really good and they can predict that kind of thing, and you just have a spammable, like, Wood Hammer or Horn Leech that hits, like, so many different things. Or they're going to have to just hard switch in and hope that they can predict your Wood Hammer. Like, switch in their Charizard Y and hope that you use Horn Leech and they quad resist it. If you predict on a Stone Edge, you are golden, my friend. That is such a good play. As I mentioned, Wood Hammer just hits so hard. Zen Headbutt's a really fun tech because it hits a lot of things that come in, like fighting types might say, you know what, I can come in on this because it doesn't have Fairy Stab. You have Zen Headbutt. And Nature's Madness, of course, is really good for chipping teams. So Bulu, as I mentioned, switches in, gets terrain, maybe sets some Leech Seeds or whatever. It doesn't always set up when it comes in. It can Nature's Madness and go out. Status and tech. Leech Seed, as I just mentioned, is a great option because now you're giving seeds and passive recovery with Grassy Terrain to anything that switches in after it. Swords Dance, Substitute, great setup options like Bulk Up. Of course, it gets Protect. Everything gets Protect, but it's good for scouting. Synthesis is good if you don't have if you're running like a fully defensive set and you can't run like Horn Leech isn't going to give you enough to withstand or to outplay things. Toxic, of course, is really good for catching things coming in that might fear Superpower. Whirlwind is a cool set, like a Berry Whirlwind set is pretty interesting, or like a Sub Whirlwind. They think that they can set up on your defensive build and you Whirlwind out. Of course, that's always going to be good. As I mentioned, bulk up is good. Taunt is great. 75 speed, you're going to be outspeeding most walls and most really, really passive mons. So Taunt is going to be great on Bulu in certain situations. And it gets both screens. So it's so bulky and it gets really good recovery options and passive recovery that setting screens is actually very viable on Bulu. So that's a great option there. And then other fun moves, Brick Break for reliable fighting. And to break other screens. Calm Mind is a really fun option if you want to go like super balanced on this mon. It's already got great defense and attack. Why not increase the special attack and special defense and just make it unkillable? Fling, of course, is always fun tech. Iron Defense is cool if you just want to be a massive defensive wall. And maybe you've knocked out all their special attackers and you just want to go. Mean Look is cool. So this is an example I had recently where I had a Landorus with this in front of it. I knew that they weren't holding a Z Crystal. This was laddering, but still, similar situation in draft. I knew that they didn't have Flyinium Z, so I knew I could sit Bulu in front of it pretty safely. You can't Earthquake. U-Turn's going to be neutral because Fairy type resists Bug. He could set up Rocks, but that's pretty much all he could do. So I thought, you know what? Maybe he will set up Rocks, or maybe he will defog my Rocks. So he defogged my Rocks. As he did that, I clicked Mean Look, and then I just set up and went and took out his Landorus, and then my electric type in the back just went ham. So Mean Look is actually really fun tech. Psych Up is cool, kind of niche, but I could see it being used. Torment is great because of the prevalence of choice users in the format. And Worry Seed is always fun because it's fun to get rid of abilities, especially in draft format. Moving on, I'm not going to take a lot of time on this. These are pretty common sets. As it goes in draft format, like I can give you these sets and they're useful, but you really want to surprise your opponent with interesting sets. But again, you know, a really defensive set with Sub Leech Seed is going to be something that might work really well with a lot of bulky teams, chipping down your opponent. Especially things that don't sit on the ground and get passive recovery and abuse your ability. Sub SD is like a super common set that you see in laddering a lot, and there's no exception. It's really, really good in draft as well. Choice Band, as I mentioned, is great. Unfortunately, it doesn't get slow U-turn options, but it's a great speed tier, and it's going to break through a lot of passive mons and walls. It's a really good breaker with Woodhammer, so Choice Band, Woodhammer, Horn Leech is going to be great for sustain, and then some coverage like Super Power, Stone Edge, Zen Headbutt. Really, really good options there. And you can run Adamant a lot because it is in that like sort of weird middle speed tier. And then Hassam variant, we have a PCL coach whose name is Hassam, and he does love to run Assault Vests on Pokemon. And Assault Vest is really good on Bulu because it already has really, really great physical defense. So dropping some special defense on top of that, and the fact that it has like good enough coverage that it can run just 4 attacks and go, including Nature's Madness to stop walls that don't have as reliable of recovery, is actually a pretty cool option. It should be noted though that without setup options, if you're sitting in front of something like Toxapex, you can click Nature's Madness. That thing can just recover and get Grassy Terrain back, so you're never going to be doing more than half to it. Because you can't poison it either. So, yeah, it's situational, but Assault Vest can be really good once you've gotten rid of a lot of the walls on their team. Some checks and counters. I think the most prominent is Fire types who quad resist Grass. They're going to be able to safely switch in if you're not predicting, and something like a Mega Charizard X, who loves that you've given him now Earthquake resistance or neutrality to Earthquake, can freely Dragon Dance in front of you because you could miss a Stone Edge. You might not risk that, or at least force you to risk that. And if they calc to live that with a pretty defensive set, or if they fire off a Will-O-Wisp because they're faster, I mean, there's so many different options. Fire types are going to do really well against Bulu. Good prep with Superpower or Stone Edge could do really well as neutral or super effective coverage against fire types who fear those moves, and predictions. It's all about predictions with Bulu. Until you have Grassy MC Woodhammer or just Banded Woodhammer, then it's not all about predictions, it's about clicking buttons. Flying types, especially with fire coverage, so things like Zapdos, which are going to resist a lot of your moves, and also can fire back a fire type move, or things that actually, Zapdos doesn't usually carry flying coverage, but something that carries both flying and fire coverage, or a good example might be Salazzle, who can come in and threaten a revenge with both quad effective poison and fire, and singly effective or doubly effective fire moves. threatening on both ends makes your switch-ins really, really difficult. So, and you're going to keep Bulu in the back for the most part and switch it in, so you're probably not going to want to sack off Bulu early. So that becomes a very difficult game when they've got 2 coverage moves that threaten you. And that's just the nature of a Fairy Grass type. Steel types, especially setup threats who are neutral to superpower, have like a secondary typing that resist it. So Pinsir, Mega Pinsir here is a really good option. You can't really do much to it. I think the hardest hit that you can do is maybe superpower, which is neutral, because it quad resists, or at least single resists grass type moves. I think it might be quad. It does really well against it. It can just set up a Sword Stance, and there's nothing that you can really do to it. Except maybe click Nature's Madness, but it gets Roost. And then bulky grass types, as I mentioned earlier, Bulu pairs really well with fire types and with flying types because bulky grass types sit in front of it. They don't care much about your stone edges, they don't resist it, but generally they can take them. They don't care about superpowers because they can usually take 2 of those and you're lowering your attack. They love your passive recovery that you're giving them. I mean, they just sit in front of you. You can use Mega Horn, but again, you're forced to use a very low accuracy move and non-stab, so some mind games there. Bulky grass types do pretty well against it. Some partners that are really good for it, anything that benefits from grassy terrain. So I have here Heatran, Volcanion, Toxapex. You've seen things that are only weak to ground, like Drapion, Alolan Muck. Mega Charizard X I've mentioned in this video is really good because it enjoys the dragon protection and the ground protection. Again, great support mod for anything that's worried about ground type. Hazard setters are really good, though it should be mentioned if you're going to run something like Toxic Spikes, you are going to be negating the grassy terrain on the opponent's side with those Toxic Spikes, which is just 1 layer, which is really, really nice. But it does incentivize your opponent on preview to bring flying types with defog, and flying types are something you would like to disincentivize if you're going to be bringing like a defensive Bulu. Bulu is going to be your defensive switch into a lot of mons, and they're running a flying type with defog and stuff like that. It's a toss-up because then also they're not going to be able to, like if they've got Crobat and that's their best answer to Bulu. Crobat's not a good example because they got poison coverage. If they've got Swellow, they can't run a choice if they need to run defog on it. So you've got a little bit of a saving grace there as well. Just something to think about when it comes to hazards and hazard stacking with Bulu. And like I said, you could hazard stack, you could set off Stealth Rocks to scare fire types and flying types. It's really good for Bulu. But for a lot of mons, not that it's detrimental to you, but you're just going to be giving a lot of that back with grassy terrain recovery if they're touching the ground. So it's a calculus you have to make every time you bring hazards like that. And then the other 2/3 of a Fairy Dragon Steel Core. As I mentioned, Heatran is a really good pair because it likes it's got quad weakness to ground, so it likes that protection. It's a steel fire type, which fits nicely with a grass fairy type. Now all you need is a water dragon type, so when we make Palkia illegal, I'll let you know. Otherwise, I guess Kingdra and grab Politoed at T4 and have a fun time. So yeah, I mean, it works really well in a Dragon Fairy Steel Core because it's a bulky fairy. We've gone over that. In sum, I would say that Bulu is an A rank. It would be S rank if it had Play Rough, or maybe if it had Slow U-Turn. Definitely Play Rough would make it S rank, but without Physical Fairy Stab, it effectively just spams grass moves and some decent coverage and has good tech. But it's an A rank because it's so good in support. It hits really hard, but it's really good with its ability and its typing. So definitely a first round pick. I would 100% support this as a first round pick, again, because it's so easy to build around. If you guys have any questions about this Pokemon or any others in our draft analysis series here, if you have any questions about the PCL, want to learn about our draft league, or you want to learn about our gym league we run on the side, definitely shoot me a DM in our Discord server for the PCL. Link should be in the description below, I believe. And I guess that's it. I am Palukkie, and I will catch you guys next time. Peace.